Druid Hill Park has always been my favorite park in the city of Baltimore. And one of the reasons is that it houses the Baltimore, now Maryland Zoo, where I visited the animals, especially all of the birds and the bald and the golden eagles. Almost daily, I would visit the eagle cage and share my sadness as to what had happened to the American Democratic Republic, which by the early 60s had become the home of corporate control of America, just as the five-star general and former President Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us in 1961 to beware of the military-industrial complex, which would eventually include our national media in 1986 when President Ronald Reagan allowed one of America's greatest polluters, General Electric, to buy NBC, thereby preventing NBC from airing anti-nuclear reporting. Now, for many months, I marveled at the feathers that my two eagle friends were wearing. They seemed to have an aura of wisdom and power, and there were many of them in the bottom of their cage, too far from me to reach. So I asked both of them if they would share one feather each, and if they could drop them next to the fence so I could reach them. I wasn't aware that it was illegal to own eagle feathers, especially one of the bald eagles. And one of the park workers who saw me frequently, because I was there almost every day, asked me why I came so frequently to sit and talk with the eagles, and I told him that I had asked these two eagles to share a feather each. He told me it was illegal, and when I asked what happened to all the feathers dropped by the pair, he pointed to a gully and said, "We dumped them there." Well, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Dumping these sacred feathers is trash. Well, the next day I returned to sit with my feathered teachers, and was just blown away by the fact that both had dropped several beautiful feathers next to the fence. I cried. They watched me and the feathers, and I decided I had their permission to select from the pile of those feathers, and I did so. Thereafter, whenever I visited them, I showed them my two feathers, and damned if they didn't look like they smiled. It was soon after this that I decided that I would learn all about all of America's symbols and share that knowledge to anyone who would listen, and I did, and still am doing it. From then on, I considered all winged beings had something to teach me. For the next hour and a half, our guest will be Evan T. Pritchard to review his extraordinary Bear and Company book, Bird Medicine, The Sacred Power of Bird Shamanism. Now, here's what my doctoral committee chairman, Dr. Stanley Krippner, professor of psychology at my alma mater at Saybrook University and co-author of Personal Mythology and the Voice of Rolling Thunder, had to say about bird medicine. He said, eagles, ravens, hawks, owls, crows, and other birds have always played a crucial role in Native American shamanism. In this remarkable book, Evan Pritchard demonstrates why these spiritual traditions consider birds to be sacred, giving numerous historical accounts, personal stories, and traditional legends that illustrate the special place that birds have in the hearts and minds of tribal men and women. Pritchard is a master storyteller. Each of his vignettes is a source of wonder and fascination. Bird Medicine is a book that his readers will find impossible to forget. That's from Uncle Stanley Krippner. Well, he's not quite my uncle, but we always called him Uncle Stan. Evan T. Pritchard, a descendant of the Micmac people, has taught Native American Studies at Pace University, Vassar College, and Marist College, and is the director of the Center for Algonquin Culture, steeped in bird lore by his Micmac great-aunt, Helen Purley. He is the author of several books, including Native New Yorkers and No Word for Time. A regular on radio shows such as NPR's Fresh Air and on the History Channel. He lives in the Hudson Valley of New York. Now, we've talked about Hudson Valley for years and years. And there he is. Welcome to 21st Century Radio, Evan.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much.
Sorry for the extended introduction, but I wanted to discuss that. I wanted to mention it.
It's always good to hear Stanley Krippner's writings. He's very eloquent.
He sure is. He's a great soul. What prompted you to write this book?
Well, it, of course, goes back to my Aunt Helen, and when I was 13 years old, she grabbed me and said, "You're a Micmac, and there's nothing you can do about it. And you're one because I'm one, and you need to learn all this and carry on these traditions." And what she was most famous for was her rapport with birds. In fact, she opened a bird show in the 1920s, believe it or not, and made friends with Chief Pulao of the Potawatomis and became long-term friends. But also, it was, it started her off when she was already very close to birds, and by the time I got to know her, and I guess study with her is probably an exaggeration, but watching miraculous things. I mean, she could communicate with wild birds, and they seemed to come at her call almost, which is very unusual. And she could understand their messages, and it was really over my head and over my understanding at that time. But I also understood from her our Micmac ways were all very important, and so I became interested in all of these kinds of things. And then I got a phone call on January 1st of 2010 from a lawyer that was representing Native Americans in an environmental case involving birds, and he asked me if I could make a convincing testimony that birds were important in Native American spirituality. And I was in Maryland, which is where I grew up, and I was near the Library of Congress. I said, well, sure, I think I can help you out. So I went to the Library of Congress, and there weren't any books that were specifically on what we in the native world called bird medicine or bird shamanism, the rapport and the ability to communicate with birds. And so I thought, well, there's a really big need for this book. But I have a lot of contacts in the native world, and I contacted a lot of them very quickly and then followed up and wrote this book based on their testimonies. And I believe there's 200 or so stories or testimonies in the book from Native people, and we've gone over very carefully to make sure that nothing's been misstated and nobody's retracted these stories as they appear in this book. And some of them are, as you probably saw, pretty miraculous in nature.
I'll say.
And so that's how it all happened in a nutshell, or an eggshell.
Yeah. Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. I think you even said that in the book, didn't you?
Well, there were some personal stories as well, so I knew firsthand this was possible. But even after working on the book, the incidents continue to happen where birds brought messages in the most amazing and clever ways. And, each one is different. That's what's amazing about it. You can't buy a bird sign. You really have to wait. Maybe you fast. Maybe you pray for one. Whatever you do, go out into the woods and communicate, and sometimes you get a message. And it's wonderful that you can't really exactly, bottle it. It's really just has to happen in the moment. So it's very close to the wildness of the ancient ways of life. And it still happens in cities such as Baltimore and New York, even today. And a lot of my stories do happen in Maryland.
Yes, we're going to touch on some of them next hour, I believe. What's the main message of this book?
Well, we need to listen to the birds. We need to love and respect them. The native teaching is that birds are our strongest allies. In fact, the songbirds evolved about the same time as humans evolved. So they're our cousins, so to speak. And, it's not so much whether they're intelligent or not. I'm not trying to say, birds are so intelligent. What I'm saying is there's something that's very interesting that happens. They seem to be able to communicate, I guess you'd say, universal or cosmic messages to us. And I know that some readers will hesitate to believe that. And that's why there's 200 stories, because when you see these stories, then you get an idea how these things happen. They seem to act as if directed by higher intelligence. Mm-hmm. And this is, again, it's part of native belief. And whether it's true or not depends on your point of view. But ancient cultures, not just Native American, indigenous people around the world see it that way. They understand their relationship with birds is a give and take. Look to birds for guidance, and we can help birds as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think part of it, too, is the message of the book is that not only should we respect and love birds, but they can help us. But right now, in these complicated times with the environment quickly changing, the birds are at risk in ways that your average person doesn't understand, doesn't know about, and is probably contributing to. Whereas the native population, because they love and respect birds as a whole and get so much from them in terms of healing, they also are aware of the dangers. So the title, Bird Medicine, has two very clear meanings. One is that they are healers for us, which I think the book proved. Two, that the birds need our help in terms of health and their well-being because of various environmental hazards that cause trouble for them every day.
Wait, let's touch on that now. What are some of those environmental hazards that they are suffering from?
Well, there's a number of them in the book. You know that CO2 is just past the 400 parts per million milestone, first time in 800,000 years, according to Washington Post. But that clearly, in my mind, changes their migratory patterns. And when the migratory patterns change, they may miss connections with other species or food sources they would otherwise because the temperatures force them into new areas. And, for example, turkeys and hummingbirds are showing up in Micmac territory for the first time, and they don't know what to do. And also so many more storms, as you've seen in Maryland in the past few weeks and up here in New York, strange storms that can harm birds, blow down their nests. They're stronger than before because of that. But also, one thing that is the BP oil we did. Washington, D.C. is a part-time home, at least to Marilyn Driscoll, who's a director of the Audubon Society, and she spent a lot of time with me talking about the complexities of the Gulf oil spill and how that affects birds. Even if it doesn't kill them, it affects them for generations. And I want to mention that BP oil was found inside eggs, crane eggs in Minnesota. Now, that's got to open up a whole new part of your brain there for a moment. BP oil found in eggs in Minnesota in nests. You know, we're talking about thousands of miles and many generations. But the thing that the book emphasizes is the effect of cell towers on birds, and it affects birds in many ways. In fact, there is a list of 10 basic things that cell towers do that drives birds crazy, kills them, or makes them lose their way. And I don't know if you want me to go through the quick 10 now or save that.
This is so important. Yeah, Evan. Really, this area, the diminishing number of birds and the quantity, I think it's important to touch on these right away because there's so many other good points we need to make later on. But could you touch on those 10 now?
Yes, sure. One of the things is that cell towers, and we're talking about 3,000 meters is when the cell radiation has the most effect on birds. But the larger birds just are driven away. They feel those, broadcasts, if you want to call them, and they just stay away. And they're very different than radio. I know you're in radio, and you wonder, radio waves are large and microwaves are small and fast, and they have a different effect. So it drives the bigger birds away, but the smaller birds are driven into holes where they seek refuge from the pain caused by these electromagnetic waves. And some of this is based on Alfonso Balmori's studies of Spanish birds with Spanish cell towers, by the way. Birds have a complex directory system in their eyes and other parts of their head, so that how you navigate through the air. And these electromagnetic waves, if the bird enters them at most angles, they lose direction and they become lost from the rest of their flock and may never return. 4, they actually are so confused by the presence of the waves that they can't mate or build their nest. Even storks, who are world famous for their, how they carry those diaper bags with the babies in them. You've seen it on TV.
Yeah, well, it's on TV.
They don't really do that, but they're famous for building nests. And in the presence of cell towers, they get so confused. They argue with their mates, and they can't remember how to build the nest, and the eggs fall to the ground. It's terrible. They are killed directly by hitting the microwaves or flying in front of them and being killed by that. There's also that it reduces the number and fertility of the eggs generation by generation, and that's very clear in the Balmori studies. The seventh one is that reduces their food supplies because it has the same effect on the mice that they would eat, because the mice are also in the path of these broadcasts, and they actually are harmed and become less in their populations. And insects, the same thing. That would be number 8. Number 9, it's found in the Balmori reports and other reports in Europe that the legs and wings are crippled by the presence of the electromagnetic waves. And the 10th is the discoloration of the feathers, either becoming darker or lighter. I personally believe this indicates the drying up of the preening oil at the base of the tail, which probably indicates that other things are drying up. So those are the 10, I say, categories of things. If you read these studies, they go on and on, but that's in an eggshell. And the cumulative effect is very considerable.
It is considerable.
These studies have not been publicized in the U.S., but they are very carefully done in Spain, and there are other studies going on in Europe, which are also, finding similar conclusions. So, as bird lovers should know about this, and the question is what to do.
Certainly. Well, it's pretty much the same way I feel about Monsanto and what's going on in Europe. And Europe has literally stood up against Monsanto. This country has not yet, and I'm embarrassed by our president for actually supporting Monsanto and Roundup, especially in regards to when you watch the Weather Channel, and that's one of their biggest advertisers is Roundup and Monsanto.
Right.
Whoa.
Well, who would ever thought of putting Roundup in food? That's crazy.
Yes.
But, yes. And speaking to that, I want to mention Europe again, France in particular. They did studies on the effect of Wi-Fi on humans, and of course this is French Wi-Fi's effect on French humans. Of course, this could never apply to Americans. But they found that, they had all these young girls in these French schools, elementary schools that we would call them, and they were all using Wi-Fi, and they started to do studies. Well, what are the effects? Well, to get graphic, one of the things is that all young women have, whether they're French, who knows, embryonic eggs. There's 400 of them, and they can be damaged, according to the studies, by Wi-Fi, regardless of their age, and that will affect the quality of the birth at any time during their life. And it damages, according to the studies, the mitochondrial DNA, which means that it'll be passed on through daughters and granddaughters, great-granddaughters, ad infinitum, with probable damage to this DNA. So the French immediately pulled, and according, this is what I've been told, pulled all of this Wi-Fi from these schools just weeks ago at great expense. But see, that's the kind of thing you think, well, that makes sense. Why aren't more countries doing that?
Well, I think we know why we don't do that in this country, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
the former head of Microsoft Canada just said the Wi-Fi was bad for you and they should get rid of it. That's a bad quote. That's a very big misquote. But, you can look it up. It's better said by him.
Well, of course, we humans also have the same kind of problems with these cell towers. And Dr. I can't remember his first name, Becker, who joined us on 21st Century Radio a number of times discussing this problem. And, of course, he specialized in focusing up in New York, upstate New York. Right? You're well aware of that. And it's just phenomenal that he was not listened to.
Well, that's because, Americans are not affected by American cell towers. It's just the Europeans are affected by European cell towers. You know that, don't you?
Yeah, of course. We were not affected by them. Well, we've got...
Well, I'm being facetious.
I know. So am I. Well, we don't have to...
It's illegal to get sick in America by any kind of cell phone or Wi-Fi because it's just against the law. passed a law you can't get sick from this, so that's it.
That's right. You can wear your cell phone on your ear, and it certainly
Correct.
won't affect you at all, right?
But see, there's no laws against birds getting sick. They forgot about that part. So now we can look at that. And of course, there's Balmori. These are Spanish birds. But you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Now, okay. Well, why are birds so important to humans? Besides, singing songs.
Well, that is what the book's about. Well, this book's about a lot of things, but in the Native American view, birds are messengers. They're spiritual teachers. They're meteorologists, first and foremost, because you can look at a bird if you have an eye for it and tell what the weather's going to be, 2 days from now or more. They can tell you about, there's a story about a Canadian woman, a Métis Indian, who was working with an Ojibwe, and they're in their house, and this robin comes to the window and starts singing this rain song, only 5 times faster and in a higher octave. And she's saying, well, it sounds like it's going to be a torrential rain. And they looked at the sky. There wasn't a cloud in the sky. So saying, what is going on? And there was a major earthquake. A few seconds later, after the bird left, trying to model the proper behavior. And so everything's shaking and breaking and thrown around, and they look like a scene from Star Trek. And then it all stops, and the Métis says to the Ojibwe, I got to pay more attention to bird sign. I mean, it's a true story, but it's funny. But they can even tell us about earthquakes. But they can also they can come into our dreams. They can give us warnings. Clearly, crows in particular are known for that. And they can communicate with us, between us and those who are departed. And I noticed today, by the way, I really looked at the book from that perspective. Quite a number of the more hard-hitting stories, or heart-opening stories, are places or moments where birds come to someone living to announce the death of somebody who's just passed on.
Let's continue with that after we take our first break here on 21st Century Radio in regards to why they're so important to us and what roles they play in our lives if we're allowed them to. We'll be back in just a few minutes with Evan Pritchard.
My name is Sally Rush Wagner, and you are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. This man knows how to interview. Stay tuned and be sure and listen to this show. And if you want to visit me, I am the director of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation. Check out our website at matildajocelyngage.org.
Well, hey, you're listening to Evan Pritchard's Wind in the Trees, featuring Native American flute music with a little bird song. Hear those little birds there? Indeed. Evan Pritchard, Bird Medicine, The Sacred Power of Bird Shamanism, Bear & Company. Order it online or link on to Evan's website at algonquinculture.org from the front page of 21stcenturyradio.com. So we were talking about the importance of birds and the roles that they play in our lives with humans. And in a very, goodness gracious, in the back of your book, you have a whole list of things, especially related to Maryland and experiences, Maryland, D.C. And we were just beginning to talk a little bit about messages from relatives, reports of deaths, etc. Would you like to give us an example of that from the book?
Yeah, sure. On page 61, there was a man, an elderly man, who was in the National Health Center in Washington, D.C., and his daughter is practicing Mi'kmaq ways, and she was singing the Mi'kmaq honor song for him as he was laying, his last day on Earth, and he knew he was dying, and she asked him if he could send her a message if he died, which he did a few hours later, in the form of a bird or animal or something, that to show her that he was okay and that he was aware of her, and her missing him, and so forth and so on, to reach beyond the veil. And he said he would try. And the man was an Egyptologist, among other things, and a follower of Horus, by the way. And what happened was that she got a call early in the morning, and he had passed away. She had to go down to the hospital and sign the papers. And then on the way back to her home in Maryland, she got to the intersection of Queens Chapel Road and East-West Highway, and there was a big traffic jam. And so they were stuck for a while, and they looked up at the top of a post right by the car, and there was a Harrier falcon standing there looking at them. It's a very large bird, and also not really in its flight path at all in Queens Chapel Road. It's not a bird that you'd ever see in an urban setting, and it's more of a Midwestern marsh bird. Well, it turns out the Harrier is the closest bird today to the Egyptian marsh falcon, which is what Horus actually was, mixed with human characteristics. And so the bird is thought of as our modern-day Horus. So the bird stares at them and then lifts up, flies in front of the car, and then goes and sits on a sign on the other side of the road. And, of course, they're still stuck in traffic because it was, rush hour or whatever. And she said, well, that's him. That's my father right there. He's referencing, Horus, and he's communicating with us from beyond the veil. It did seem likely. I looked into it, and I looked at some of the comparisons in the book between his life and the life of your average Harrier, and it really was extensive. So it goes on and on about all the parallels between him and that bird. A very quiet person. Of course, the Harrier is a mix between an owl and an eagle in some way. Or an owl and a hawk, actually, because it has the quietness and the acute listening of the owl, but it's actually in the hawk family. So he was a quiet but very observant person, and the references to Horus were kind of obvious. So that was a Maryland story in which somebody had apparently sent a sign consciously from beyond. And it was the timing also. We have to look at every factor. And I know probably a lot of your listeners are saying, oh, yeah, that happened to me, something similar. It's part of it is the timing, and part of it is the species, and part of it is the person, and all the factors come in. The timing was exactly about the time you'd expect. I think it was noon, that moment where you'd be looking for that sign from that person because they had just passed away. But another one I want to mention was with me, as that there was the well-known Cherokee in Havre de Grace named Blessing Bird. I'm sure some of your listeners knew her. She did a lot of ceremonial work, and I had gotten a story from her. She saw a eagle marriage over the Susquehanna River, where I believe it's the male flies under the female and passes upwards a fish, and she accepts it. That means she accepts the marriage. But I wanted that story in the book, so I wrote and called to get her permission, and then someone else got back to me saying that she had passed away. Well, I was very struck by that because I'd known her for many years. I didn't know she was sick. And I had to go to work. So I'm driving along this parkway and thinking, of course, of her, and then this large female red-tailed hawk starts flying next to the driver's side window. Now, usually, in my experience, these hawks, when they're communicating from the dead, fly on the passenger side so that you can still drive, but this was very dramatic. It was on my driving side, inches from me, and just stayed there and was flying and coasting right by my head there, and trying to drive the car was very difficult. There was a cliff on the other side, and then it lowered down and coasted for a while. I could see the patterns on the back, and then it lifted up again and got ahead of me, and then it slows down, turns and stares at me, and then I got this feeling like there was a message. It was her saying, yes, I'm fine, hello. And then the bird flies ahead at the end of the cliff. It gives a tip of the wing and a salute, and then shakes its head in an understandable sign that looks like it's saying, see you around, and then flies off into the woods. And when that bird disappeared, I couldn't remember where I was going because it was so dramatic. And then I said, uh-oh, there's my exit. So I did manage to get to work, but I think she really wanted to be in the book. And there's other stories about her, too, that happened in Baltimore.
Well, I wish we could just do a show on the stories, really, because they are just so exciting. I don't mean exciting in the sense of waking you up and everything, but they're so internal. I mean, it brings all living things together, which I think is just the most important thing to do at this particular time in history in this country when we're so divided. Uh, it's so important to see how birds do it is just amazing, just amazing.
Well, they have a lot of love, and most people may not think of that, I guess, unless they have one. But when you have one at home, you have a loving relationship, but the birds can't give you signs very easily because they're in a cage. But when they're in the wild, they're more able to communicate, but they still have that love, that sense of recognition. And certain species like seagulls remember individual peoples for years. Can I share a quick seagull story?
Oh, please do. I'd just love to hear stories from you all night.
Well, they're all pretty amazing.
They are.
But they recognize faces. They recognize sailors at sea, for example, after 10 years. And if there was a sailor that did a favor to a bird, and the bird came back and, honored him. But there was a story about a young man living off the Atlantic Ocean who would take the shrimps from the Chinese food that his mother was feeding him, and he would, kind of steal the really good tropical shrimp, and he'd feed it to these seagulls. And they remembered him, and like 10, 15 years later, he was at college, and he had a ballpoint pen, a golden cross pin from his uncle, who was chief. He dropped it in the parking lot and walked on unaware with his two friends. And then the same seagull, who had been enjoying the shrimp 10 or 15 years earlier, goes and picks up the pin, sticking straight out of his mouth. He drives, through the air, and his two companion seagulls are screaming. And they come swooping down over the boy's head and drop the pen against his book so that it slides into his chest so that he will feel it. And he picks up the pen and he raises it in the air. This is a Nisqually Indian, by the way. He's well aware of bird lore and very versed in traditions. He holds up the pen, shows it to the bird, and thanks the bird. Well, that's the kind of things that birds can do, some species more than others. But the seagulls remember. And a seagull, talking about messages from beyond, my mother's Micmac people are from Maine. When I was 15, and I guess the same year I met my Aunt Helen, I was walking along the beach, this particular spot that I liked, and this seagull came swooping down and dropped a full-size fish at my feet. And I picked it up, said, well, I'm not hungry, thank you, and I threw it into the ocean. So the fish lived. But it took me 40 years to figure out what was going on. It turns out, I mentioned this story 40 years later to a close relative who said, oh, well, that was your Micmac grandfather's praying spot. And he would, at dawn, put tobacco at that spot as the sun was making its red road across the waves of the Atlantic Ocean, and as it reached the shore, he would place tobacco and make a prayer in the morning, all my relations, and so forth and so on. Well, that was the spot where the seagull had landed that fish. So you can kind of do the calculus, or you can say, well, there's no connection, but to me, there's a connection.
Well, that's obvious to me. There's a connection, but I'm biased. I can't because this is the kind of thing that I've always wanted to be true to begin with.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take our break here at this hour, and as we go into this break, we're going to listen to "Wind in the Trees." Yes, "Wind in the Trees" by Evan Pritchard.
From River Song, which is a CD over an hour long. There's lots of music on it.
Well, I've got to get a copy of that.
Hello, this is Joanne Shenandoah. I'm a Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter, Native American Music Award winner, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
That's Aunt Joanne. Yes, Aunt Joanne. Okay, you're listening to Evan Pritchard's "Wind in the Trees." Want to tell us a little bit about your music?
Sure. Okay. The CD is called River Song, and a lot of it's improvised in layers. I improvise guitar, improvise flute, improvise with the synthesizer or orchestra and percussion. And most people don't do that because it's kind of hard to do, to dub over something where you perform without regular rhythm or pulse or regular meter. So it's very open and free. And then to do that over and over again in the studio or live, it's a little tricky. So I worked on this technique, and this was a kind of a breakthrough musically that, to have that, it conveys a Native American feeling musically of being free, of being open, like the birds. And you're just, these, what do you call rubato or free rhythms, is very, very expressive. So it's a very expressive kind of album, if you will, and there's all kinds of different combinations, and there's voiceovers in some of the tracks that have like prayers that are in Algonquin languages, and I'm familiar with and have published books on Algonquin languages. So a little like a Lenape prayer goes, Inu Patamawa Kishilumokang. We pray to the one who dreams us into being. Inu Kichumpis and Maskaneso Lenape Wapsikan. We make strong medicine today with our words. We speak today as one with the great mystery, Al Sudamagishik Manitou. And we offer great thanks, Wanishik. It goes on like that with music behind it, and some are in Micmac, some are in Unkachag, some are in Munsee, some are in Unami. But it creates an incredible atmosphere. So each track is different. I can say it's over an hour of music, and I'm basically giving them away for $10. Actually, $15 include postage, and may I mention my P.O. box?
Well, please do. Of course you can.
Okay, so people can get River Song, which I think is a very interesting CD, from Evan Pritchard, P.O. Box 140, Salt Point, New York, 12578. And that should do it. And they can write a check to Evan Pritchard, and I'll send it out. And I think they'll love it.
Well,
but it has bird songs on several of the tracks, and I do go out and record birds now and then. I like thrushes, and you'll hear some thrushes on these tracks, and as well as other things. And there's actually a Micmac Eagle song, which I get a lot of positive comments about because it's decided to do harmonies with that song, even though it's traditional. Mm-hmm. And there's sound effects of the wind blowing in the sky. So thank you for allowing me to mention that. Thanks for playing it.
Well, of course, boy, Evan, it certainly makes one heck of a difference in listening to music along with these stories. I would love to listen to this stuff for about 5 or 6 hours. It just opens one's heart, and also,
and I'll be happy to send you one.
Thank you. Now, hey, if this is the first book on native bird shamanism, how'd you go about doing your research?
Well, it's interesting. When I looked into the question, okay, are birds sacred to Native Americans? And again, this was a courtroom situation, so you don't say, "Oh yeah, sure." Right, in that kind of context, you're asked to be an expert witness to defend the beliefs of Native Americans in the religious context. So you say, okay, I need some backup here. Yes, of course they are, but what does it mean and why? Well, there are numbers of books that have paragraphs mentioning colonial accounts of encounters with Native American shamans who believe, for example, that when they pray for the Great Spirit to come, that the spirit may materialize in the form of a bird. And you think, well, that's crazy. But then remember, in the Bible, that's what happened in 5 out of 10 translations of the New Testament. The dove, so to speak, at the baptism of Jesus materializes. It's not a regular dove. It's a universal perspective that we have lost, that birds can be actual materializations of spirit. And the Cheyenne believe this, and there's books that I found in Library of Congress that say so. Well, I wasn't satisfied with what colonialists said, so I went to, I don't know how many countless numbers of contacts in Native Americans I've interviewed from my previous books, Native New Yorkers, Henry Hudson, the Algonquins, No Word for Time. I've had a lot of books published in this field, and so I went back to almost all my previous sources, and I said, have you ever been touched by a bird in a miraculous way at an hour of need? And this was like a magic question because people either said, I don't know what you're talking about, or they said, absolutely, sit down, I got to tell you the story. And the stories were beyond my expectations. And I'll just tell you one more, well, I'll give lots of examples, but there was a fellow who was a elder of the Anishinaabe living in New York, and he was a wee man. His wife left him with these boxes. He said, put these up on the top shelf outside here. Here's the ladder. I'll be back in a few minutes. Get it done. He's trying to climb the ladder, and a ruffed grouse comes up and pecks him on the ankle. And he turns to the grouse. He said, well, I'm supposed to climb up this ladder I got a job to do. So he goes and puts the other foot up on the ladder. The grouse runs around and bites him hard on the ankle. Mm-hmm. So then he's got to sit down on the stone wall and to rest his, massage his feet, his ankles. The roughed grouse comes up on the wall, jumps up on his right shoulder, and stares into his right eye. Then runs around him, jumps up the left shoulder, stares into his left eye, then gets up on his head and looks down at him in both eyes, and then comes into his lap and he's tapping and pecking on his chest. And this man is saying, well, look, I respect that you're a bird, but you have to respect that I'm a human, and I got to get those boxes up there, and my wife's going to be mad. And the grouse wouldn't let him. So the wife comes back. She says, how come the work isn't done? He says, well, we have a visitor here, and he tells her the whole story. She says, you need to speak to your uncle in Canada because he understands bird medicine, which is a phrase people use. So they jump in the car, and they go to Canada. He tells them the whole story. And Uncle Henry, who is the on-reservation, local shamanic elder, he says, you're sick. And my elder, Eddie, says, well, I'm not crazy. It really happened. He said, no, you're sick. You need to go to a doctor. So they jump in the car. They go back to New York, go to the doctor, and the doctor looks in his right eye. He looks in his left eye. He looks in both eyes. Then he pounds him on the chest. He says, you're sick. You have a heart condition. You should take it easy. You should rest. You have a serious heart condition, and whatever you do, for God's sakes, don't climb any ladders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, what a story. What a story.
That's a true story.
And I laughed so much when I could just see the grouse doing this, coming up and stopping him from doing that. And I was wondering.
So he goes, well, of course he goes home and he thanks the grouse who's standing there waiting for him, right? And he says, thank you very much. Great, you make house calls. You saved me a lot of trouble. You saved my life. The grouse bows to him and then, nods and then flies up in the air and disappears and is never seen again.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many good stories like that. They really just lighten up the heart. By the way, what was your first unusual bird experience?
My own, I think it was the fish on the beach in Old Orchard, but I would like to tell you, my sister is a big partner in this. My sister Lynn has been more into birds, and she had an experience in Maryland that I must share.
Okay.
She was, as a teenager, she was canoeing with her friend, whose name was Sally, not Sally Roche Wagner, who was a heroine of mine, but with another Sally. They're somewhere near the Cedar Swamp, Eastern Shore, Maryland, and they're in an area that nobody ever goes, and they just decide to drift along in this backwater, it's like, I guess you'd say, wetlands. There's lots of reeds. And they go into this magical place where there's big clearing of water, and there's about 18 to 20 snowy egrets standing in a circle, a perfect circle, by the way, and they're looking at each other, and they're sailing through, and it's like, uh-oh, what are we in? What's going on? And then the opposite snowy egrets paddle to the center of the circle, and they start to push against each other, and they start to flap their wings, and they levitate high up in the air, and the others are watching and dancing side to side. And then they come down again to the center, and they go back to their places. And then the next opposite pair of snowy egrets does exactly the same thing, and it went on and on and on. Well, she realized it was some kind of mating ritual, but she thought, this is pretty crazy. I can't tell anybody. And so there was no photo. She didn't have a camera. It was she just wanted to be quiet and to see this mating ritual, which apparently happens in Maryland for snowy egrets from all over the place. Well, I saw a photo of that, a similar photo from this Jan Hendricks, and I contacted him and I asked if I could have a printout for my sister's Christmas present, and he agreed. And so I gave her a couple Christmases ago this big, huge photo of the egrets in a circle, which kind of allowed her to express herself with this memory.
And it's also in that photo is also in the book. We have to break here at the top of the hour. When we come back, we got to hear more stories. Really, this is just so wonderful. Evan Pritchard, Bird Medicine, The Sacred Power of Bird Shamanism, Bear & Company. Order it online or go to Evan's website, algonquinculture.org, or from the front page at 21stcenturyradio.com. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus, and my executive producer and research assistants Laura Kortner, and our engineer is Kristen Hagerick. And right now, we are listening to Evan Pritchard's Wind in the Trees CD. As a matter of fact, let's see. there are so many more important stories here. They're much more important than anything else I would really want to talk about, because our listeners, I'm sure for our listeners, they've had some experiences of this, but they didn't, there's so much skepticism all the time when it comes to animals and animal consciousness and that kind of thing. And it takes a while, especially in this particular culture, to get to that particular information. And you were on the way of talking about, you did talk about your favorite one, but there must have been some things within this book that you, that must have been really a big surprise to you.
Yes. Well, let me talk about, I want to tie that in with our friend Stanley Krittner, because I was looking for how do I prove, I was beginning to understand through studying crows that the elders and the shamans, medicine men or women, were possibly able to travel inside birds and see through the eyes of birds at a distance of what was going on and come back and to actually have that information. And I thought, that is pretty crazy. That sounds like somebody's, drug experience. But it seems like it's true, because the crows gather and have their crow councils at the places where the Algonquins used to gather hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And how would the birds know that? And the humans certainly don't remember anymore. So I thought they must have been traveling in the birds and then continue to do so. So I thought, well, who could I go to get scientific evidence? Because my book, by the way, is a scientific book. I mean, it's not pretending that you can prove all this scientifically, but, the research based on, statistical and interviews, whatnot, their case history. So I thought Stanley Krittner could probably help me. So I went down to Broadway in Midtown New York, where Stan happened to be giving a talk. And I tracked him down there, found him, he recognized my name, we were old friends, and it was a beautiful reunion. And I said this question, how can I prove that these elders are actually traveling consciously inside birds? And he said, why don't you ask her? And he pointed to a friend of his who was standing there in this little room, and she said, I was an assistant to Rolling Thunder. I said, oh, my God, I got to talk to you. So we sat immediately down. Stan said, go for it. And she began to tell me all these stories how Rolling Thunder every day in the morning would sit down and process all the things that had happened the day before. And she said almost every day he had an experience of exchanging consciousness with birds. And so there was your smoking gun. There was your proof, in a sense, that here we have somebody of renown who regularly claims to travel inside birds. So then looking at the crows, it makes a little more sense that they're still traveling the routes and gathering at the places that the Algonquins gathered 1,000 years ago. But there were other pieces, like I talked to Benta Henson, who is Australian, and I called her. I said, well, somebody who knows this stuff really far out, she might know. And it turns out she worked with the Aboriginals and Indigenous people in Australia, including the Noongar, who are very mystical people. And she said, of course, they all do that. I mean, it's just, you learn that in kindergarten, to travel in birds, they do that, and they come back. And she actually she has some Aboriginal ancestry, but she's more of the European. But she also had experiences. She was dreaming she was traveling inside an American bald eagle, which is not a bird she could have ever seen, except in movies, traveling across North America and seeing the United States very clearly from the air. And in fact, she ended up decades later moving to the United States and seeing those same things. It's just like, how do you say it? I want to convince the reader, the most scientific, rational reader, that there might be something to all this. And that was probably the most far-out stuff, was the idea that human medicine could travel inside birds. But it actually becomes the theme of the whole book, in that almost all of this makes more sense when you think that either a departed spirit or some cosmic energy can actually enter these birds with their permission, apparently, and communicate a message. That's what the essence of the book is.
Well, the essence of the book, it's so wide.
What?
It's wide-ranging, this book. That is,
yeah.
a person who had no academic background in anything that could have really, really enjoyed this, and then scholars would especially enjoy this because of the quality of your documentation. I'm amazed that you don't have you were not given a PhD for this work, because this is primary, basic stuff that just did not exist until you wrote this book. I mean, it existed in other cultures, but it was not published in the mainstream. And that I think is enormously important. Gosh, Rudy.
Well, I would appreciate if somebody granted me a doctorate because, it took 3 years.
Oh, yes.
And every word has been gone over. There's lots of footnotes, lots of referencing. Everyone's given permission, all this. It's very carefully done because, of course, it started out with a testimony in court. But, it's anthropology. It's not really so much a book on ornithology, although there's traces of that. It's a book of anthropology where it talks about how Native Americans or these Native Americans view birds, and it's very surprising what they can tell.
Yeah. Well, as you touched on Native Americans here, our listeners have heard us talking about a great deal about the League of the Iroquois and how they ordered their society with balance between the male and female power and reverence for nature. Can you share some wisdom from the non-Iroquois nations who specialize in regarding the status, especially in regarding the status of women?
Yes, and I'm the head of the Center for Algonquin Culture. I focus on Algonquin-speaking cultures, and there's about 84 nations in U.S. and Canada that would qualify. And I just want to say that, Eastern Shore, Maryland is filled with Algonquin people at contact. And the Ark and the Dove, and there's the dove, the bird, the two boats brought the Catholics to Maryland for religious freedom. They had they settled at Prospect Island, which is, I think that's another name now. And the Tayak, or the chief, came out and was delighted. They were so respectful that they didn't just invade their shores, but waited on an island. So said, you guys, anything you want, anything on the top shelf, come on in. And they shared their land side by side. Every house had a wigwam or a wicco up next to it. They lived literally together. And so they were starting to have this successful Maryland colony, religious freedom, and they ran everything by the Tayaks in the Piscataway, so, people. And so this woman, Margaret Brent, was the woman who wanted to hold office and be a leader in the community. And normally, they would have said no because, women don't count in those days. And the Piscataway said, well, why not? She has every right, we respect our women. Why don't you? So they got guilty and they elected her. And then a black man who was in the community came forward and said, well, if you can elect her, why not me? And then the passengers of the Ark and the Dove, who are now this very successful colony, were saying, well, wait a minute. These people are basically slaves. We don't know. And, well, that's kind of tough. Are we really going to be able to have a black leader? And again, the Tayak said, well, what's the difference? You people are not the same race as us. He's black, whatever. Why can't you run? So, in fact, Matthias de Sousa ran and won and became the first elected black official in what's now the United States. And, of course, that immediately leads to Obama, so forth, so on. But there's 400 years in between we won't talk about. But this is Maryland's history, but this is also the way the Algonquins saw the whole race issue and male-female. And especially important were the wives of chiefs. So often the chiefs were chosen through the sisters' lineage. And also, when they died, their wives would often take over as chiefs and often become very successful, and they were called Sukswa. It means they're the high woman, and they were respected as chiefs, and they had complete powers of to make war and peace in those cases. And it's interesting that when Woodrow Wilson was very ill and they thought he was going to die, his wife, who was descendant of Pocahontas for real, with all of the she studied all that, she knew she was from Pocahontas' Algonquin people, and she took over the government for 18 months. It was very successful, and then he happened to get better. And everybody was kind of, oh, well, now we have to go back to the old guy again, the old geezer, so sorry. That was Edith Galt Wilson, one of the most successful non-presidents ever to lead this country. And I think Michelle's pretty good. I've got to say, Michelle Obama's pretty savvy, but, Edith Galt Wilson really actually led the country, if you look it up.
Wow.
And Algonquin.
Yeah. Well, are there any documented instances of Native people's surprise and confusion about the lack of status of women among Europeans?
Oh, yes. The most famous one was, I also have some Wampanoag ancestry, so I have some of the bring your leaders to us tomorrow, and we'll talk about this gift we want to give you. So the leaders came the next day, and it was all men. And the Wampanoag chief says, wait a minute. They said, we asked for your leaders. Where are your women? That was the famous, moment in history. Where are your women? And so, of course, now we say that all the time. But they said, well, you asked for our leaders, and none of our women are leaders because we don't believe women should be leaders. And they said, well, it's funny because the gift we were going to give you was to tell you that if you have balance between the male and female leadership, then you will have peace and peaceful government. But if you only have men, that within a generation you will have war. And of course, famously, the original, the contact between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoags was Metacomet, Wamsutta, etc., Wanalancet, and they maintained peace for a generation, and then the next generation had war. So those words were prophetic, to say the least. So women were, that was probably the earliest incident where women were, not being respected. And so the Thanksgiving that happened there was not ideal and was not as portrayed. The best Thanksgiving was the one that happened in St. Mary's City in Maryland. It was totally peaceful. And, of course, then the Virginia colony came over and killed all the Maryland people and chased them off, unfortunately.
Yeah, geez, oh whiz. Now, can you tell us anything about your nation's understanding of the earth as mother or of female divinities and creation stories?
Yes, I could go on and on about that. We have we do see the earth in two different kinds of generations of motherhood, in that the Usit Amu, or in Micmac, or the surface of the mother, is what we call the mother, and that's the colorful green biosphere that we enjoy. But there's also a grandmother, and that's the lithosphere, the rocks that are further down. So it's a little more complicated than what people tend to translate as Mother Earth. But, when we say Mother Earth, it's an entity. It's a living being that we can communicate with, and at times perhaps even speak to. And everything is centered on that. You always start with that. It's what unites all the Native people. And I just want to tie that in with Maryland again, because, of course, where you are right now, with where I have spent a lot of my life, is that you have a lot of Shawnee people in Maryland, in the Panhandle, and the area of Frederick, various spots, and you have Lenape-type people with the Nanticokes and Piscataway, the Conoy, around the bay. Well, it turns out that I recently learned from an elder speaking from the oral tradition, the Shawnee and the Lenape used to be one people thousands of years ago, and Shawnee their ancestors were people among the Lenape who decided that they wanted to honor and worship Kukim Sina, Kokum meaning grandmother and Sina, sacred. That's Mother Earth. That there's the grandmother that they felt was more important than Kishalumokung, who was the one who dreams us into being. Well, we know in Native culture there's Mother Earth and Father Sky, both have important roles. And so the Lenape were leaning a little bit towards the Father Sky, and these new people decided that they were more in love with Mother Earth, and so they started to have disagreements, and they thought it was better if they split off. So the Shawnee were the people that went south, but they reunited hundreds of years later again in Maryland, living side by side, but with their separate rituals and their separate identities. And I believe that Kittabakundi, which is placed in Columbia, Maryland, according to linguistics, I would say probably a Shawnee village with some Piscataway influence. Maryland's history is actually little known and complicated, but once you understand they were both Shawnee and Lenape together, then it makes more sense. And they didn't mix because they had already decided that the Shawnee would have the female god and the Lenape the male god as primary.
Well,
Does that help?
Yeah, sure it helps. Yeah, let's get the better understanding of this balance that we have lost in this country. There are a couple of things we absolutely did not, even though our founding fathers studied and allowed the Iroquois Haudenosaunee come in to our dear friend John Fadden. I enjoy him so much, and the stories in regards to how the Iroquois would sit in Continental Congress and critique it, and they would teach. Now, why this is not in, well, it's certainly in my books, and it's certainly in other books that our friend Dr. Bruce Johansson and others have done, but it's not in any particular curriculum, and there are certain individuals in the media that would not even allow it, and that is one of them is Rush Limbaugh. He would not allow it.
Well, John Fadden helped me a little bit with my book, and there's a drawing by him, I don't know if you saw, because of the research found that birds respond strongly to human dress and are confused when people change their clothes.
Yeah, I love that. I love that part in your book.
It's a great phrase. That's Stella Kaplan who wrote that. And so I went to John Fadden about the Gustoas. Do you think it's interesting? They're wearing feathers on their hats. Is there any records of like that being some form of nonverbal communication? Well, he said they didn't have stories about specific communication with birds, but they understand that when they wear those feathers, that by clan, by nation, that there's some kind of honoring of the birds there. So John Fadden is wonderful to work with. You're right, and I also want to mention that Charles Thompson was a member of the Continental Congress. He ran the country, if you could look this up, Charles Thompson ran the country when everyone else was on vacation. And
That's
when
right.
they weren't actually meeting, since they didn't have cell phones, believe it or not, he ran the country by himself when they weren't in session. And he was trained at an early age by Delaware chief T.D. Skunk, who was upset about the British, what he was doing to the Munsee before he was doing it to the colonists. He wanted a good translator because they were lying to him. And so he trained Charles Thompson to be actually meticulous in Munsee, Delaware, and of course then already good in English, and so he translated those and learned a lot about the Algonquin political system, which is extremely strong on civil rights, and the Bill of Rights is clearly influenced in its content by the Algonquin influence of T.D. Skunk. Charles Thompson really had a tremendous influence on the Constitution. I wrote about this in Nowhere for Time, which is fortunately not really easy to get right now, but which had a long life and will come back, trust me, about the influence of T.D. Skunk through Charles Thompson on Thomas Jefferson.
Well, Charles Thompson has been a hero of mine for about 30 or 40 years. You know a good deal more about him than I do, but I greatly appreciated, as you said, he was inducted, I shouldn't say inducted, he was brought into the Delaware tribe, and I think his name was He Who Tells the Truth, or something?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Is that his name?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's the one, along with William Barton, that put together the Great Seal of the United States, and those 5 arrows that were pushed. I mean, that's a really good insight, because that's the Native Americans' method of Iroquois anyway of saying what gives a nation strength is coming together, all the different factions, etc.
Yeah.
And they actually put 5 arrows bound together on one of the great seals, and of course it was called the illegal eagle at that particular time, because they didn't know where it came from. And but now we know where it came from.
Well, there's and it's one of the great stories, that there were 5 Iroquois and Ongwaone nations, by the way, that was before they were Longhouse, who, if they bound together, they could not be broken. It's a wonderful story. There's a book published by Iroquois Books, you can look that up, which has the Great Law. It's called the Great Law, and it actually has the Great Law text in there. Everybody should read that if they're interested in Iroquois people. And also there's the Two-Row Wampum campaign in New York. And Google that. I'm very involved in that. Totally support their initiative there. But I haven't told you the story of the Mount Vernon eagle in the book. Can I just try to summarize that quickly?
Yes, we'll end the show with that. Go ahead, please.
That's another Maryland story. There was a woman who was, I'm sorry, her name. She worked in L.C. Avery, a Choctaw descendant, moved to Washington, D.C. area, lived on the Potomac River, and became a science teacher, environmental science, cleaning up the Potomac River, also communicating to the native pair of bald eagles who returned to the Potomac because the fish had returned because of L.C. Avery and her friends, and she lived near Mount Vernon. And the eagles then returned to the place where George Washington used to sit and look at the eagles and really, wonder about them. I'm sure his heart went up to those eagles. And of course, he had learned from Franklin that eagles were a symbol of freedom and liberty to the Mohawks, based on the Treaty of Albany and their conversation. So they came back to the Potomac to eat the fish and knew, of course, who it was to credit, which is Alfie Avery, this Choctaw woman. Well, she died January 13th in 1999, and she had a funeral, which many people came to. And then there was a ceremony on the banks of the Potomac River at the spot where she used to take her water samples, and they planted a tree of peat, which is actually an Iroquois custom. And these two birds, the same eagle, came down very low and flew in circles over the heads of her family as they sang a song to the four directions, and then flew away again, I believe, with the tip of the wingtip, which just seems to be the style as I imagine it. But this was published in a local newspaper, that this was actually observed by dozens of people. And, of course, it's a very emotional moment that these eagles that were friends to this woman, Alfie Avery, actually came to her funeral to honor her for cleaning up the Potomac River.
Oh, boy, that's one hell of a good story. We are out of time. I also want to thank you for, throughout your book, mentioning Blessing Bird, because Blessing Bird used to call in to 21st Century Radio and on Zoe's show. And as a matter of fact, she made little things and sent them to us, bookmarks and things like that with our names on it. She was such a wonderful person. I know she's passed on, I believe, right?
Yes, that's what my story was. And I'll just say that the best story in the book was about when she fasted for a name, for the name Blessing Bird. She went out to Leakin Park, and she went to that falls. Which falls is it? Hold on a second.
Gwynn's Falls.
To do her fast. And that was when the hummingbird came to her and crawled inside her pipe and left a green hummingbird feather. And then when Grandfather Sings Alone came, he saw that and said, "You've been visited by a hummingbird, and your name should be Blessing Bird." Such a wonderful story. You have to read the book in order to read that story.
Well, boy, it's been a great joy having you on, and certainly you've got to come back. We've got to talk more about your music and a number of other things. It's been quite a joy spending this last week.
I want to come back.
Oh, good. All right. Well, thank you. Please hang on. Friends, we're going to, when we return, we'll be joined by Steve Yeager, who won an award for the best documentary film at the Sundance Film Festival a little while ago. And we will discuss his latest film, Toy Soldier. We'll be back in just a few minutes. 21st Century Radio is produced by Hieronimus and Company. Our executive producer and research assistant is Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington, and I'm Dr. Bob Hieronimus.